Except it's not really Sparta. It's the Religious Studies Project. Why do you think I'm doing this bad impression, Chris?
Well, I think it might be something to do with the similarly bad accents that happened in that wonderful film 300.
300. This is our 300th episode. Well, our 300th numbered episode. We're actually past that. But nonetheless, officially, this is our 300th episode.
Oh, that's really good that Daan Beekers and gets to be speaking to me as part of our 300th episode. I'm just remembering as we're recording that there was a couple of things that I said I was going to clarify before we started going. So let me go for it. Dan wanted to say that he realized he'd made a mistake in this interview because I made him say, tell me about Dutch religious history, Dan. And he just sort of had to give me a brief synopsis. So he wanted to point out that although he says that 25% of Dutch are religiously affiliated, he meant that is incorrect. He meant 25% are members of church congregations specifically. Mm-hmm. So that is just something to point out. Yeah, we spoke about spatial contestations and conversions. So it's basically about buildings and what happens to them when they change hands. Take it away, me. Listeners to the Religious Studies Project, particularly in a European context, might be quite familiar with the site of a former church building that has now turned derelict or is being used for a purpose that perhaps it wasn't intended for, or is being rejuvenated by another religious community, another Christian community, and so on. That's certainly the case here in Edinburgh, where I did my doctoral work, and I'm joined today by Daan Beekers to discuss spatial contestations and conversions, particularly looking at former or different church buildings in the Dutch context. So first off, Dan, welcome to the Religious Studies Project.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No problem, Dan. Dan is currently a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Institute for the Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. And before coming here, he was a postdoc researcher at the Department of Religious Studies in Utrecht, where he was researching the abandonment and repurposing of church buildings, first with the HERA project Iconic Religion, and then with Birgit Meyer's research program Religious Matters in an Entangled World. And we'll hear about both of those presently. His doctoral dissertation was defended in 2015 at VU Amsterdam, involved doing a comparative ethnographic study of religious commitment among young Dutch Muslims and Christians. And he's currently completing a book manuscript based on this work. And his publications include the volume Straying from the Straight Path, How Senses of Failure Invigorate Lived Religion, published with Bergan. And he co-edited that with David Close. So, Dan, first off, let's maybe, before we hear about the Dutch context in general, it might help if you could maybe situate your work and the trajectory of it within those two big research projects. I know I certainly know a lot about Iconic Religion through its UK team, which involved Kim Knott, who was my doctoral supervisor.
Sure,
so maybe just tell us a little bit about those projects.
Sure, yeah. So Iconic Religion project started in 2014, and I joined that I would say just after completing my PhD thesis, but I was actually still completing it and joined that project. And that was a project on the visible presence of religion in urban space, and specifically in Amsterdam, Berlin, and London. The project was a cooperation between researchers of Lancaster University, which is where Kim Knott is still based, and then Utrecht University with Birgit Meyer, and Bochum University with Volkwart Krech. And it really focused on how people in their everyday lives encounter religion in a very tangible, visible way. And I was coming from doing my PhD thesis on religious youth, so young Muslims and Christians in a Dutch secular society, which actually very much focused on religious commitment and in a sense religious vitality. And I always kind of knew that there was another side to the story of religion in the Netherlands, which is of course rapid secularization and dropping numbers of church attendance. And then I was starting to notice all these buildings in the Netherlands which are being closed down and converted for other purposes. So I kind of got more and more interested in this other side of the story. So what happens to Christian culture or Christian material culture when church buildings are no longer being attended by people? And so when I applied to this project, to iconic religion, I argued in my research proposal, this project is on the visible presence of religion in the city. And I would actually argue that the transformation of church buildings is actually one of the most important changes in how religion is present or absent in the city. So that got me onto the project, and I started that in Amsterdam.
Excellent. And then what we'll hear now, I suppose, about the specific work that you did, but again, we've hinted at it there, but for the sake of our listeners who may not know anything about the Dutch context, could you maybe sort of 2-minute sort of religion in the Netherlands?
Yeah, sure.
Particularly perhaps Amsterdam.
So the Netherlands has sometimes been characterized as one of the most religious nations of Europe, or one of the most Christianized nations of Europe. So religion was very important in Dutch history and for like the political emancipation of Europe or independence of the Netherlands vis-a-vis its former ruler, Spain, which was Catholic. So the Dutch, in their own perception, liberated themselves from Spain and became a Protestant nation. So Protestant identity was very important in the Netherlands. For quite some time, Catholicism and also what was seen as dissenting Protestant groups were given very little space to observe their religion. And then you got the process of what is known in the Netherlands as pillarization. So the coming about of different pillars after the time, after the French Revolution, when Catholics were again given the room to practice their religion and to manifest themselves in public space. You got this very strong mobilization of religious subcultures or pillars that were really important in people's everyday lives. They really organize, much of social life in terms of schools, housing, work, and so on. So in that time, religion was very important in the Netherlands, and this actually was up to like the 1950s. And then, as elsewhere, a rapid process of secularization was setting in, or unchurching, as we say in Dutch. I think this is not a very common word in English, but I like the term unchurching because it's more specific than secularization. And there's, of course, a lot of debate about what secularization is and whether and to what extent it has taken place. So the Netherlands changed from being one of the most Christianized nations of Europe to becoming one of the most de-Christianized ones, with, as I said, a very quick process of secularization, and to the extent that today, only about 1/4 of the population considers themselves Christian or religious, I should say. And only about half of them would actually attend religious spaces on a regular basis. So it has become, in that sense, a very secular country today.
Yes. And am I right in saying, is this an Amsterdam stat or a Dutch stat that 2 churches are closing per week?
Yeah, this is a Dutch, a national. So this has been estimated. So hundreds of churches have closed down in the last few decades. And so the state's agency of heritage, of cultural heritage, estimated that the rate of church closures will continue by around 2 churches a week. But I've also been told by others, by another agency organization in the Netherlands, that this should actually be 4 churches a week. It would actually be a more realistic estimate. So it's really an astonishing speed by which these buildings are being closed down.
Absolutely. So before we get into some of your specific case studies, I think when we first met to discuss this interview, one of the first things I wrote down was like, we'll have no essence questions, which is sort of my critical RS hat, wanting to emphasize that even by having this conversation, we're not saying that a building in itself is religious or that it is sacred or holy in any way. What we're doing is we're looking at the ways in which the buildings are interacted with and discursively constructed, and the way they occupy space in this heritage discourse and in individual and community memories and so on. So we want to make sure that we get that in there, that it's not inherently holy in that sense. But then also in one of the articles that you sent and I read through, you spoke about the difference between sort of theories in heritage and theories of heritage. And that might be a useful thing to mention just before we go into case study.
Yeah, these are terms I think coined in an article by Waterton and Watson, Framing Theory, I think it's called, the article. And so they distinguish between different kinds of theories about heritage. And one distinction that they make that I find helpful is that between theories in heritage and theories of heritage. What you see when you look at literature on Christian material culture, a lot of that work, not all of it obviously, but quite a bit of that work kind of asks, how can we preserve this heritage for future generations? So what are the best practices in preserving this? What threatens it and so on? So all these are questions which I think are very important, but they are questions that are located within the heritage discourse. So it's already taken for granted that these are important places of heritage. And a theory of heritage, as Waterton and Watson put it, would actually ask what makes these things heritage? Why are they defined as heritage and by whom? So there's a whole question of representation and discourse and power relations and so on. So for what purposes are they heritagized? A terrible word, tongue twister. And also what new fault lines emerge in this process. So who's being left out? So there's quite interesting work now being done in Christian heritage, which also talks about the ways in which populist politicians, for example, are now very apt at mobilizing, Judeo-Christian heritage in their political discourses. But in important ways, it's also a discursive tool to exclude Muslims and migrants and so on. So it's also a way of defining who's out.
Yeah.
So that would be more kind of a theory of heritage approach.
Yeah. So analyzing all these discourses that are invoking heritage, who's included and excluded, why certain things are thought to be worthy of preservation. For example, I'm thinking in my own work in Edinburgh, yes, there's plenty of the idea that all these churches, yes, they're part of the urban heritage, should be preserved, etc. But, well, first of all, what should they be preserved for? And we'll get on to that in your examples. There are certain uses that are seen as more or less appropriate. But also, there's a certain image of what a church is. And here in the south side of Edinburgh, we've got the Salvation Army over on St. Leonard's, or we've got the True Jesus Church down in Gifford Park, which have both been here for decades and decades, but they don't look like churches. In the popular imagination. So they don't feature in anyone's idea of something that should be preserved. Because there's a very specific thing that looks like a church. It should be preserved.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Let's contextualize it a bit here, I think. And I think we're probably going to use two examples particularly. There's the Fatih Mosque, and then I don't know if I'm going to pronounce it right, is the Chassé Church?
Chassé Church, yeah.
Chassé Church. Yeah. And possibly starting with the Fatih Mosque might be a good example of the various discursive entanglements that are going on. So we tell us about it and why it's interesting.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the Fatih Mosque actually when you were making that point about church building being recognizable or not as churches, because the Fatih Mosque is one of the largest mosques in Amsterdam that has been around for a few decades already. It opened in 1982. But it's located in a former Catholic church on the Rozengracht in the center of Amsterdam, actually very near to the Anne Frank House, which many people would know, and the Wester Church.
Well, yeah. I presume I've seen it actually when I was in Amsterdam, but I didn't notice it.
yeah, exactly. And that's the. And people actually even often don't notice the church, even though it's quite a big monumental church. But I think many people are very much focused on the Wester Church, which is like the main Protestant church right next to the Anne Frank House, and kind of the Rozengracht, the street is kind of a street that people quickly pass through. So somehow, when I talk to my friends and family in Amsterdam, they often don't even know this church. Sometimes they do, but they almost none of them would know that there is a mosque in that church right now. And that's actually also an issue that the mosque community is facing at the moment. So I've written an article together with my Utrecht-based colleague Poyan Tamimi Arab for a special issue on iconic religion in the journal Material Religion. And there we also showed how the mosque community, especially its younger members, are struggling with this image of being a kind of a hidden mosque. And it's actually this very term hidden mosque that is often used by people, by visitors to the mosque, for example, also by non-Muslim visitors, local politicians and so on. And that's actually one of the points we make in that article, that this, it's interesting that this term is used, the notion of a hidden house of worship, because it's actually a historical discursive genre in Dutch religious history, which was used in that time that I referred to earlier, when Catholics were not allowed to publicly worship. So they had to resort to clandestine churches, often on attics, and these were called hidden churches.
But why is it so hidden then? You write about something to do with the entrance, particularly. There's no signage, so why is it so hidden? How does that make? I guess you've mentioned the young people sort of constructing it in that way. How do the users of the mosque feel, and how are they trying to combat that image now? I think.
Yeah, so it's hidden. It's quite interesting. So so this has to do with the material legacy of the church building. So the very fact that they are located in a church means that they are not very recognizable as a mosque. There's a mosque here nearby, also in a church building, that few people would realize or recognize as such. Another important point is that it has to do with a kind of mismatch between Muslim sacred space and the way in which this particular building was organized. So when this Muslim community constructed their mosque within this building, it turned out quite quickly that the direction of prayer in Islam, the Qibla, was precisely in the opposite direction to the direction in which the Catholics had prayed. So normally you would come into the church through the entrance, and there, you would face the altar and pray in the direction of the altar. And in this case, this was facing the west. So what the Muslim community did or had to do was to construct, to close down the entrance, basically, to construct a wall there, which would become their, their prayer wall, as it were, and the side of the prayer niche. And they constructed a very small entrance on the side. And what was the former entrance of the church became a space for shops. So at the moment, there's actually a bike shop there. So when you pass this building, the first thing you see is a bike shop, and it is quite difficult to actually realize that there is a mosque here. So what this community is doing is they're currently in the process of building a new entrance in order to become more visible as a mosque. Yeah. And one interesting thing in this respect, perhaps, is also that in a way it's also a story about history repeating itself, because on this very site there once was, before the Catholics built their church there was a headquarters of an important socialist movement in the Netherlands. And that was first converted into, so that site was first converted into a chapel by Jesuits. Catholic Jesuits, but they were facing similar problems as the Muslims are facing now. They kind of felt, as one Catholic author in that time, so this is the early 20th century, as one Catholic author said, this place remains the theater of socialists, and where we have our altar, but we know this was once the stage from which the socialist leaders would give their not sermons, their lectures and their political rallies. And, one of the only things that would mark out the space as Catholic was that they placed a big cross on the top. Yeah. And similarly for the mosque now, one of the only things that marks it out as a mosque is that they placed crescents on top of the church, Yeah. So there's this, small things that mark out the space, as religious, but also a struggle with people that, conversion is never really complete.
Yes.
Right. So people always struggle, or very often struggle, in a converted space with, what I've elsewhere called sacred residue, some kind of leftover of its previous use, which might enable, which might make certain things possible, but it also constrains particular usage or representations of the space.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode. And some of that might be material presence and sort of material evidence in a sense, and some of it might be discursive and remembered. If I were to go in there, I may not know anything about its socialist history, but I would probably be able to detect the mosque and the Catholic Church, but again, that shows the importance of historical context and lived memory of the space as well. So while sticking with a former Catholic church then, the Chassé Church gives some really good illustrations of how this notion of heritage is mobilized or contested by a variety of different constituencies. So perhaps again, you could just introduce that specific case study, but then also all the different groups who have a stake in it.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So this Chassé Church was also a Catholic church from around the same time as the one I've just talked about. So they were both built in the 1920s. And they both actually had a relatively short life. So the Chassé Church closed down in 1997 because of dwindling attendance. And then it was actually desolate for many years. It was dilapidating. The building wasn't doing very well. And there was a lot of conflict around what should happen to the building. And what's very fascinating in this case is that when it closed down in the late 90s, both the municipality and the Catholic Church, or the diocese and the local parish, actually decided to demolish the building. They said, it's going to be very difficult to reuse the space in a productive or in an efficient way. It also doesn't really have any kind of special heritage qualities. And, also not unimportantly, it will get us more money if we demolish it and sell the land. And the Catholic Church very much needed this money because they had to renovate another church in that neighborhood that was going to be their main Catholic church, parish church. But then local residents who were themselves not church going started to mobilize themselves and to very much advocate for the preservation of this church building. So you have this really interesting debate between a local Catholic organization that says, we can get rid of this building. We don't need it anymore, and it's not going to be, helpful to leave it there. And local people who are not part of that community who actually stand up to save, quote unquote, that space.
And people who probably didn't particularly care about it when it wasn't being threatened. It was just a part of their familiar urban environment. Exactly. And then I guess when this moment happened where it was potentially going to be threatened, then
that's a very interesting point. That's it's interesting to see how people suddenly become aware of these kind of iconic sites when they're threatened to disappear, really. So then in this case you see quite different positions. So trying to make sense of this this paradox, if you will. So between local people who you might describe as non-religious, who want to, safeguard this building, and Catholics who want to demolish it. Trying to make sense of that, I've conducted field work there and talked to many different groups involved, and what I kind of found is that people ascribe quite different values to a site like a church building. So for many people, they would say, okay, this is more than a building, right? So this is kind of a mantra that you hear very often in these discussions. But what they mean by this mantra, this is more than a building, is very different for different parties involved.
Yes.
So for kind of the parish leadership and the officials at the diocese, or the religious leaders there, they would say, a church is a house of God, so it is a very important religious meaning. It's a sacred place. It's consecrated, and sure, it when it's closed down, it is deconsecrated. But, in the memories of people, it always remains associated with something sacred. So it is very difficult to remove this kind of aura of sacredness from a Catholic church. So that's really, a strong, so that they kind of see the church as a house of God, really. If you talk with the local parishioners, so the members of the community, they would often share this view. They would often say, yes, it's an important religious space, sacred, a place of God. Struck me is that for them, it's also very importantly about community, so a place of a local community coming together, a very familiar place that is imbued with local histories, but also personal memories and so on. So it's really a communal place in that sense. And people have all kinds of very intimate personal memories of church buildings, and they went through very important personal life events there, right?
Yeah.
Baptism, weddings, and so on. And I talked to these local, so these parishioners, it's maybe also good to say. So the ones, this is quite a long time ago, but I managed to find a few of them who were still around. And they said, at the time we were quite okay with the idea of demolishing the church, because for us also, like one of them said, when I go back to the church now, and it has been, I don't know if we mentioned this, but it has been converted to a dance studios.
Yeah. Important.
So it's now a dance studios. And she said, like, if I'm back there now, it really feels uncanny, it feels, it's no longer a church. It's no longer what it was in my memories. And it is still connected to many of her memories. So it's still a very important place for her, but it is no longer what it once was. So it's kind of a disorienting kind of experience for her. And then so they were happy, but then the local residents who were very unhappy about the idea of demolishing the church, for them, it's very much a place of, local belonging, so a place that makes them feel at home in their neighborhoods, and especially after it was converted, you see that many of these local residents are very happy about the way in which the converted church building as a dance studios brings back life to the neighborhood and a sense of community and belonging and so on. So what I found very interesting here is that whereas for many parishioners, kind of the closing down of the church represents a loss of their home, for these people, it actually indicates a return of a home, or like something that helps them to feel at home in their neighborhood.
Exactly. Yeah, I found, again, church attending individuals in the South Side here talking about, well, for instance, the South Side Community Centre, which was the former Nicholson Street Church, and it was a carpet storage place for a while, and now it's a community centre. So I heard time and again the idea of, I didn't like it being a carpet showroom, that now it's a useful place. Or someone else said, I really like that it's sort of being used for what it was built for the community. And again, these are people who weren't participating in it when it was a religious place, or quote unquote religious, but now that it's being used, it's fulfilling some sort of model of the ideal. This is what religion or Christianity is meant to be. Right.
And this is actually, it's interesting that you say that, because it's a very same point that the owner of the dance studios makes time and time again, that, by giving it its new purpose, he's actually bringing back the building to its original purpose, which is of bringing people together.
Yeah.
But of course, it was bringing people together before God, right? For a very particular purpose of worship, and that part is, in that sense, left out.
Exactly.
Even though that guy, the owner, I should say, is quite spiritually inclined and interested in religion. But then you have, and that's maybe an important point to make, other local residents who, and in a sense, that's like a fourth group giving a particular meaning to the building, who very much emphasized the way in which that church building is a very important part of Dutch religious history and symbolizes Dutch history. And actually the spokesperson of the local committee advocating the preservation of the church very often made this point, and said, if you demolish these buildings, you actually demolish your history. What I found interesting in that case is that these people actually said, this spokesperson and like-minded people, they didn't really care that much about what happened to the building, right? They said, what, of course, as long as it's not giving them too much, nuisance in terms of like parking space problems and that kind of debate. But they didn't really care whether it would be repurposed for religious use or for secular use but they said as long as the building is preserved, because that building is important for who we are, for our identity. So there you get more of a Christianity as cultural heritage discourse, exactly. But which is often kind of propagated by people like the ones in this case, who quite explicitly distance themselves from Christian beliefs and doctrines and so on. So they're often quite self-conscious, self-consciously secularized people, who are nonetheless very passionate about the importance of Christianity as culture, as history, as art and identity and so on.
Yes. So there we have those sort of four constituencies: the institutional church, the parishioners, the former parishioners, the local residents, maybe non-participating residents, and then this whole sort of heritage industry, historians, that kind of thing. And you can see how these different discourses, they could maybe even use the same language, but they could be mobilized for quite different purposes, positive or negative, depending how you want to inflect it. Yeah. We're already pretty much out of time here. And I know that we could talk on a lot more, but we'll certainly direct listeners to you have an excellent blog post which summarizes a lot of this, and your material religion article, and then hopefully some more will be coming out. But I just wanted to finish with a final couple of questions that we've been talking around this. We've been talking about former churches, and we should also say that sometimes there'll be a church that's then used by another Christian group as well. Yeah, that hasn't really come up at all yet.
Very often,
Would we find this same sort of processes happening if we were looking at buildings that weren't churches, like just sort of other prominent local buildings, or does that question even make any sense? Is there something to do with these being churches that has meant that they are, given the sort of iconic status that they are? Is there anything inherently religious here? I know the answers. I know the answer before I get there.
In part, partly yes, partly no. So I think you see similar things happening with, non-religious sites, old post offices, water towers, and these kinds of sites, which are often also very important local landmarks, and, often inspire the same kind of local concerns about maintenance and preservation and local, these places belong to who we are, to our identity as a neighborhood. But at the same time, I do think there is something, it's always kind of a bit risky when you talk about it, because you get to this kind of, there's something extra to these buildings, but in the way the people talk about it. So if you look at people's narratives and ways in which they relate to these buildings, people also often have this kind of idea of a sacredness associated with these church buildings. Or, as one local resident said to me in relation to the Chassé church, a few years ago, the clock was restored to the tower. It had been silent for a few years, and it had been restored now. And he said to me, now I feel that the soul of the neighborhood is back. So there seems to be this kind of sense, kind of spiritual or religious side to these buildings that is important for the way in which people relate to them. But also, I think especially when you look at today's debates about heritage, this religious aspect is also very important. And this really marks these places out, like, or sets them apart from, for example, old post offices.
Yes.
You know, the fact that, so church buildings really lend themselves to this kind of idea that, you know, these sites are, you know, as part of our religious heritage, they are very important to our identity and to who we are, you know, as Dutch people, as European people, as, you know, British or Scottish people. And I think that's an interesting shift also maybe that's happening now in our kind of post-secular age, if you want, that, you know, kind of this move from people kind of complaining a lot about churches and taking a lot of distance from religion to kind of reappraising religion, but in very particular ways. So in ways that emphasize history, art, culture, and heritage.
Indeed. Yeah. So there's a sort of lingering insider discourse, I suppose, on the sacrality and on the sort of import of the buildings, but then also in these urban spaces in Western Europe, it is going to be churches that were given prominent spaces. They were intentionally built to be eye-catching and dominating the skyline and the centers of communities. So is it any wonder that when we do look for sites where there are a lot of discursive contestations happening, it probably is going to end up being these places, regardless of any sui generis argument about them having some inherent quality. It's historically they've been prominent due to the specificities. For you, you're writing up your book.
So I'm actually at the moment I'm very much working on my older project in a way, which is still also my current project. So on comparison of Muslims and Christians in the Netherlands, trying to finish my book manuscript now. Also working on a special issue on this topic. And I'm hoping in the future, perhaps here in Scotland, to kind of converge these two projects together. That's kind of my hope and my aspiration. So to really connect this study of what happens to Christian material culture to questions about religious pluralism and relationships between Muslims and Christians, religious coexistence, and so on. So in a way, that's also already what I was doing in the case of the Fatih Mosque in Amsterdam, but expanding a bit on that, and to kind of see if we could, or if I could use questions of heritage as a lens to look into religious diversity and coexistence.
Fantastic. Well, Daan Beekers, we look forward to the fruits of that research when it emerges, and thank you for your time.
Thanks so much.
And thanks so much for that really, really interesting conversation there. I'm wondering whether have we had Kim Knott on talking about spatial? We have.
Indeed.
Because you said, you were talking about hands at the beginning there. And, and that's her model, is she uses a hand to discuss spatial models as well. So go and check that out if you need
that was one of our first year batch of interviews. That was before she was my PhD supervisor.
Wow.
And we've then been through that whole process. Right. And Dan was her postdoc on the Iconic Religion project. So that's what a lot of we were just talking about there.
Very good. So if you would like to charm a major scholar into becoming your PhD supervisor, why don't you consider becoming an interviewer for the RSP? We're looking for some new people. We do it every year. We like to bring on a few new interviewers, new respondents, sometimes move around the editorial team every year. So if you would be interested in maybe doing a couple of interviews for the RSP, drop us a line at editors@religiousstudiesproject.com, or, tweet at us or whatever. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll get the process going from there.
Absolutely. Next week, we're throwing in a bit of bonus content for you. We've been mentioning all year that we've been producing these extra episodes for our Patreon subscribers. So this month, we thought that we'd be kind to all of you who maybe don't yet subscribe via Patreon or don't have an institutional subscription. And we're giving you an episode of RSP Discourse, the June Discourse episode. It's got Brianne Fallon, Ray Radford, and Carol Cusack.
And our Patreon subscribers get an episode of Discourse every month covering current affairs. They also get irregular episodes of Are You My Data, which are more listener-driven interviews with major scholars. The last one there was with Anne Taves just a couple of weeks ago. Really entertaining.
I thoroughly enjoyed it, yeah.
Yep. These are, partly we're throwing one of these onto the feed as well because we're proud of these different formats we came up with, and actually, you know, we quite like them. So we thought you might enjoy hearing one as well. But if you're a Patreon subscriber, a BASR member, an NAASR member, then you also get access to these episodes. So please do check them out.
And I think that's us for now. Thanks for
listening.
The RSP is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Marek Sullivan and Rebecca Barrett-Fox, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop, and video editing by Jonathan Tuckett.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.